Privileged to introduce Professor John Wyatt, who's Professor Emeritus of Ethics and Perinatology at the University College London, and he's also honorary consultant neonatologist at the UCL hospitals, and he's also involved in a research project here at the Faraday Institute on artificial intelligence and how that interacting with us as humans and how we see ourselves as humans, which is very fascinating. So he lectures, and he also is involved in radio and TV media as well in his role as an ethicist. And now he's going to talk to us about matters of life and death.
Thanks, Ruth. Well, thanks very much. And it's a privilege to be able to speak. And I'm sorry if I've got the last slot, but we're going to be looking at some highly complex, challenging, and difficult issues, and I'm afraid if you're expecting some nice, slick, simple theological answers to complex problems, I haven't got any, but I hope together we can wrestle with some of the challenges which advances in science and technology at the beginnings and ends of life in particular are causing, and I think particularly for this audience, how we respond theologically and pastorally to the challenges that are coming. So I'm basically a baby doctor, at least I have worked for more than 25 years as a specialist in the care of newborn, working in a big intensive care unit in central London. I've now retired from my NHS position, but I'm still involved from an academic point of view. And I've spent many hours struggling to save the lives of tiny little babies, some of them going down to 23 weeks gestation, literally 500 grams, and literally fitting in the palm of my hand. It's a very technologically challenging and sophisticated enterprise. We have a very large team of doctors and nurses and other professionals. It costs something like £1,500 per baby per day to provide this level of intensive care. And the total cost of ensuring the survival of an extremely premature baby can be as much as £100,000, all paid for by the NHS, all provided free at the point of need. So clearly we as a society are saying that these little beings are profoundly valuable and important and significant. That's actually my head, my hand, and one of the babies on the baby unit, just to give you a sense of perspective. And as technology advances, it raises all kinds of challenges. This is an MRI of a premature baby's brain, showing bleeding in the center of the brain. If we can predict brain damage and predict the likely outcome, how do we use this information? Is it ever right to switch off the life support machinery? And how do we make these decisions? Who should make these decisions? Should we try to resuscitate every single baby, however severely malformed they are, or are there babies that we should allow to die? So I went into this area because it was a fascinating area technically and medically, and I loved working with babies and children. But I then discovered I was in the midst of an ethical maelstrom, and was challenged as a Christian believer as to how to build a bridge into this highly sophisticated technological world. And then it gets worse, because just one floor away from the hospital, from the neonatal intensive care unit, where I spent so much time, is the fetal medicine unit. And here a number of pregnant women from a large area of London and the southeast are referred if an abnormality of the unborn baby, the fetus, is diagnosed. And again, technologically sophisticated, ultrasound, genetic screening, sometimes fetal MRI, which is now being increasingly used. And quite often this procedure, amniocentesis, is performed, where fluid around the womb is removed and analysed. And here are the chromosomes from an unborn baby. We know she's a little girl. She's got two X chromosomes, but there's an additional 21 chromosome. So medically this is trisomy 21, and that means that we can predict that she's going to develop Down syndrome. We can't see from the chromosomes how severe it's going to be, it could be life-threatening, it could be major malformations, it could be relatively minor, but we do know she will be affected lifelong by this condition. And every time this is diagnosed in the UK, the mother will be offered to have a termination, an abortion. And I don't know whether you know what percentage of women in the UK in 2015 chose to have an abortion when this particular chromosomal abnormality was found. Does anybody know what the figure is? Or it's about 90% or thereabouts so 9 out of 10 women will choose to have an abortion if this condition is found. And what's also troubling is that because the amniocentesis procedure itself carries the risk of causing a miscarriage and therefore the death of the fetus, you can calculate that for every baby who is diagnosed with Down syndrome, there's a risk that another baby will die, a healthy baby will die as a result of the testing procedure. And because of a little known fact of the way the abortion law works in the UK, but it's actually legal for an abortion to be carried out at any stage in the pregnancy, all the way up till term, if there is a risk that the baby will be significantly handicapped, is the wording of the Act. And therefore, although the numbers are small, on a regular basis in my hospital, abortions are carried out, so-called feticides are carried out at 24 weeks, 26 weeks, 28 weeks, 32 weeks, even 36 weeks. And on many occasions, I've been called up from one floor of the neonatal unit to go up one floor to the fetal medicine unit because a mother has asked if she could talk to a paediatrician about whether or not to discuss the possibility of having an abortion. And the baby in her womb is considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than the one we're struggling to save one floor down. And then you ask yourself, how is it possible in one hospital and in one NHS for these apparently totally contradictory activities to be going on? And as you might imagine, it causes a great deal of psychological distress and confusion and concern for the health professionals involved in these situations, trying to get your head around it. And I think philosophically, the answer as to how it's possible is because we live in a pluralistic society. We live in a society where there is no fundamental agreement about some primary philosophical issues about the value of human life. And we therefore can end up with mutually contradictory ethical procedures or ethical thinking, ethical frameworks going on. In fact, I have argued that the framework of thinking that's going on in the neonatal unit, the ethical tradition, is consistent with the Judeo-Christian tradition, that all life is precious and valuable and special and to be protected, whereas the ethical tradition that's going on in the fetal medicine unit is more in line with the classical Greco-Roman ethical tradition, which saw human life as potentially disposable. And in fact, as you probably know, both abortion and infanticide were very common in the classical era at the time of the New Testament was written, and so on. So these are profoundly complex and troubling issues, and I immediately I want to say that I'm very aware of that these are much more than just interesting, complex theological, philosophical issues, but these are profoundly human issues which touch all of us. And I think that, sadly, a lot of damage is often done by well-meaning people, including Christian people, who talk about these issues with sort of harsh rhetoric and judgments. You've probably heard these kind of phrases about the Holocaust of the unborn, or the slaughter of the children, or these kind of harsh rhetorical language and sometimes practices. And I understand why people say that, but I think it causes actually far more damage than good. And we need to I think, find the right language to talk about these things. And it seems to me that we should talk about these issues with tears in our eyes rather than with judgment and with rhetoric and harsh language. But the other thing, of course, we need to remember, and partially this is so important, that these are not just issues out there in society. No, they're in here, in this room. I mean, I don't know anything about you, but I can guarantee there are any number of people sitting here who, including myself, have been affected by these issues, by issues to do with infertility, with abortion, we'll also talk about dementia and terminal illness and genetic disorders and so on. These are something which touch all of us, and therefore it's all part of our human fragility and frailty, and it's so important to remember this. One of the sad things is that there are so many people sitting in our churches and Christian communities who have been deeply affected and traumatized by these issues, and yet they couldn't talk about them. It's completely hidden below the radar screen. I attend a large central London church, and I know that there are any significant numbers of people sitting in the congregation who've been traumatized by past abortions, and yet it's completely taboo. You cannot mention it, and it's a deep, deep problem. I'd like to tell you that the statistics out there in society are that 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, and for every woman there's a man who's involved as well. It is absolutely ubiquitous. And yet, it's the topic we cannot talk about. So we can talk about child abuse, we can talk about dementia in our elderly relatives, we can talk about orgasms and you name it, but we cannot talk about abortion. And the shame issues are greatest within the church. If you do want to talk about your abortion, then for goodness sake, don't mention it in church. You can certainly go and talk to a secular counsellor, you can go to your GP, you can go to an abortion clinic, but for goodness sake, don't mention it in church, because the shame issues are so profound. And I have to say, I do find this deeply troubling, and I think, what right have we as a Christian community to tell society that the gospel is good news in this kind of area, if actually we can't even tackle it ourselves, we can't even raise these issues within our own community. So there are those arguing in the secular world that abortion is a moral duty, particularly if you know that your baby is going to be damaged or to have problems. This is Glenn McGee, an American philosopher. There can be no question that a couple who find out that their infant is sure to suffer and die incurs special responsibilities. From time to time, genetic testing will suggest a duty to abort. And it's interesting to see how the language about abortion has changed over the years. When the Abortion Act first came in, 1967, it was seen as it's just 50-year anniversary, interestingly, this year. It was seen as an act of compassion in rare cases of suffering. And then with the rise of women's liberation and feminism, the whole rhetoric changes, and now it becomes an act of liberation. It's about personal freedom, my right to choose. And now the rhetoric's changing again. Now it's about social responsibility. Now it's about how irresponsible it is to bring in a child into the world who's going to be handicapped, or who's going to be unloved or unwanted, or not have the best possible start in life. So if you think that's troubling, it's all about to get much worse because of advances in technology, and that's because of this thing which is called non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. So it turns out that during pregnancy, small quantities of fetal DNA are circulating in the mother's bloodstream. And it's now possible technically, by just doing a simple blood test in the mother, to isolate the fetal DNA and effectively to get a complete readout of the fetal genome. And at the moment, this is still a research procedure, but the NHS is planning to introduce this into routine practice, at least in a limited form. And it has the advantage that you don't carry the risk of having amniocentesis, which might cause fetal miscarriage. But what it is going to mean, I suspect, in the future, is that increasingly pregnant mothers are going to be confronted with all kinds of challenging problems. So fast forward 5 years and you or your daughter or your partner is pregnant and everything's fine, and you go to the clinic and they say, we'd just like to do a blood test, check that everything's all right. And you go back 2 weeks later and they say, well, you're having a little girl, congratulations, but unfortunately there's a 50 to 60% chance she's going to develop breast or ovarian cancer before the age of 50. There's an increased risk of type 2 diabetes and possibly a risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, do you think it would be appropriate, do you think it would be responsible to bring this baby into the world? Or do you think it would be better to have an abortion and have another try to bring a healthier child? So you can just imagine the sort of complexities and the challenges which pregnant mothers in particular, are going to face in the future. As somebody put it, godlike knowledge leads to godlike responsibility. And the question is whether we as human beings have the ability to take on this responsibility for the godlike knowledge which technology gives us. And so increasingly voices of people with disabilities and genetic conditions are being raised. There's a whole campaign now, as you may have been aware, called Don't Screen Us Out, which is people with Down syndrome who feel that it's like there's a massive juggernaut of the healthy majority saying, we want to get rid of people like you, people in wheelchairs, people who clutter up the place, people who are different. We want to use technology to make sure that we get the right kind of people. And technically, it's possible to get the incomplete DNA sequence in this way and of an unborn baby. And as genetic knowledge increases, it's going to, and using artificial intelligence and big databases, it's going to be possible to get really quite accurate predictions of all kinds of characteristics from the fetal genome. And not just about diseases, but about all sorts of other characteristics as well. So this is quite an eminent US lawyer predicting the future, which is always a dangerous thing to do, but says within the next 20 to 40 years, it is likely that the majority of babies in developed countries will be conceived in IVF clinics and receive whole genome sequencing as embryos before being selected for transfer to the womb. Now, whether he's right or not, I don't know, but it's technically feasible. And you could imagine people saying that, well, you know, that old-fashioned way of making babies, you know, God, dear, so barbaric, so 20th century, you know, I mean, this is the brave new world now, you know, we can make babies under highly controlled and sophisticated ways. So interestingly, IVF, which started as a means of treating infertile couples, is increasingly being used as a means of getting access to the embryo, as a means to then manipulate and change the embryo. So when I was a medical student an awful long time ago, back in the 1970s, I went to a lecture on how to make a baby. And what I learned was that a man and a woman had to have sexual intercourse, and 9 months later out popped a baby. So I wrote it all down very carefully in my notes. Although I had actually worked out that bit already. But if you go to the same lecture today, this is what you will learn: that you need to have an egg donor, you need to have a sperm donor, you need to have a uterus, a womb, and you need to have someone who's going to care for the baby. And so it's perfectly possible for one person to have 3 mothers, to have an egg, to provide the egg, somebody different provides the uterus, someone different who cares for the baby. And of course, there's no reason why these 4 things have any connections at all. So you can see all the various permutations and combinations of egg donation and embryo donation and surrogate motherhood and so on. And it's perfectly possible just to go on the internet and purchase, using your credit card, each of these things. So you can go onto the internet. There are websites where you can find an egg donor. You can go through all the characteristics and select the best characteristics. You can find a sperm donor. Again, you can go for celebrity lookalikes. So these websites allow you If you want your child to look like Prince Harry, you can find a celebrity look-alike, a donor who will be as most closely, and etc., etc., etc. You can find surrogate mothers, many of whom are in poor countries, and you can purchase a surrogate mother in India or in Eastern Europe. Embryos can be converted, sent across the world. This is called reproductive tourism. It's a big business, and it's increasing business. And it is this whole mechanization of and control over of human reproduction. And of course, it leads on to all kinds of issues. This is Elton John and his male partner who used surrogate mothers in order to create babies. And genetically, precisely who's related to who is not clear, but there they are, a happy family. This leads to the possibility, bizarre possibility, that was reported recently where a daughter had a terminal condition, and shortly before she died, she arranged for her eggs to be removed, and then said specifically she wanted her mother to be implanted with her eggs. So that, this went to the courts, and the courts agreed, provided this was clear, this was what the daughter wanted, and so the child has actually been born, and the child is both. This woman is both the grandmother and the mother at the same time of the child, and so you can see the sort of confusions that causes in families. And this is, I don't show this picture in any way, as a sort of shock horror, but actually as a sort of rather sad, tragic picture. But the person on the left is a genetic female who then underwent hormonal treatment to turn herself into a man, but her uterus was retained, and then she then decided that she wanted to carry a baby, and this is her female partner. And again, these are the confusions and complexities and strange things which technology allows and enables. You may have heard about this, the three-person embryo, the three-parent embryo, and I'm not going to deal with these issues in any detail. There'll be opportunity for Q&A afterwards, and I'll be delighted to talk in more detail about some of these issues if you'd like me to. The possibility of embryo so-called editing, genome editing, is now a reality. So that when we create an embryo, it's not just a question of selecting between embryos, but it's actually now possible to intervene into the DNA and actually edit it and manipulate it and change it. And positively, that raises the possibility that for the first time there is actually a treatment for horrific genetic disorders such as thalassemia or sickle cell disease or Huntington's chorea or muscular dystrophy. So one could intervene into the embryo and actually repair the abnormal piece of DNA. But at the same time, it raises the whole possibility of manipulating embryos in order to enhance particular characteristics and so on. So I think just to stand back from all this, it's interesting how different forces going on in our society combine together in very powerful and potentially dangerous combinations. So you can see at least three different forces going on here. On the one hand, you have the consumerist generation, where I want is the overriding. I want to have a baby. I don't want to have a baby. I want to have this kind of baby. I want my desires to be fulfilled. And then you have moral relativism that says, well, why not? I mean, provided it's safe, provided there are proper safeguards, then who are we to say that a transgendered man with a uterus should not be allowed to have a baby placed in their womb? Who are we? What right do we have? So moral relativism basically says, why not? And then technology says, well, we worked out a way to make it happen, but it will cost you. And of course, technology always comes with a high price tag, not just an economic price tag, but there's a human price tag as well. So the new emerging technologies have enormous potential for therapy, for treating conditions which previously were not possible. But they always carry within them an inherent potential for manipulation and instrumentalization, to take human beings and use them as instruments, as tools. And especially, of course, it's the most vulnerable people. So one of the fascinating things to me watching all this is that the most sophisticated technology that's possible and available is used to support ancient power imbalances. So all this brilliant technology, what is it doing? Frankly, it is enhancing existing power imbalances. It is enhancing the power of rich white men mainly to abuse and instrumentalize poor, non-white, and often embryonic or vulnerable individuals around the world. And as C.S. Lewis said in his prescient and brilliant essay, The Abolition of Man, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So whenever you hear this phrase, power over nature, you should substitute power exerted by some human beings over other human beings, that it's all about the power relationship. And so often technology is about power, and it's about the power of the strong over the weak. It doesn't have to be, of course. Technology can be used to reverse power balances, but without intervention, so often that's the way it turns out. And I think one of the things as we as a Christian community need to do is we need to develop a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of technology. Part of the problem is we are so immersed in technology that it's invisible to us, and we don't see the power it has over our lives. And in that old proverb, if you want to know what water is, don't ask a fish. And that's our problem with trying to understand technology, that we are so utterly immersed in a technological, sophisticated and constantly changing environment that we don't see what's going on. But the Catholic philosopher George Grant has wrote, now dead, but wrote some very perceptive writing, and this comes from his work. And he said, even in the very word technology is a neologism, techne logos, and in the very word is the combination of knowing and making, techne and logos. But what Grant points out is that technology is orientated towards the mastery of nature. Both nature as a whole, but also, and specifically what we're talking about now, human nature, that technology is orientated to allow human beings to master and exert power over human nature. So you'll know this, the roof of the Sistine Chapel, and it's Michelangelo's version of the creation of Adam and of humankind. Well, The Economist magazine not long ago had a cover. There is Adam in all his glory, although interestingly for 21st century sensibilities we have to have a strategically placed laptop. But notice now that the lightning bolt of creation is going in the other direction. There is no God, there is no creator, there's only Adam, and now Adam has taken over the role. And the article was about synthetic life, but it very neatly encapsulates the change in worldview. Artificial life, the stuff of dreams and nightmares, has arrived. And inside the article, the normally staid economist said, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. You know, there is no choice. Technology has enabled us to become gods, so we might as well get good at it. So that's issues about beginning of life, technology and so on. Just very briefly, again, to mention issues at the end of life, and again, happy to talk more about issues to do with euthanasia and assisted suicide and care of the dying. But as we all know, there's been increasing pressure for the law to be changed to allow some forms of medically assisted suicide in the UK, and a constant stream of tragic stories in the news. This is the tragic story of Daniel James, young, very promising rugby player, played for the England junior team. Was involved in a rugby accident, fractured his cervical spine, paralysed from the shoulders downwards. He was a very sporty, athletic young man. He became deeply depressed. What's the point of living? His parents tried to chivvy him along and bought training equipment for him to use at home and so on. But eventually he persuaded them that if you really love me, you'll help me to kill myself. And eventually they went with him to the clinic in Dignitas in Zurich. He took a lethal dose of poison and died. And the coverage in the UK was generally very positive in the media. You know, what noble, loving parents. They put their child's concerns first. They weren't selfish. They didn't insist that he live. And why on earth did they have to travel to Zurich? Why couldn't this have been made available but under the NHS? Again, many other stories. This is another tragic story. Tony Nicholson with the paralysed after a stroke with the so-called locked-in syndrome, whereby he's completely normal intellect and awareness of what's going on, but locked in a body that he has almost no voluntary control over. And he decided he wanted to end his life, but was physically unable to do anything to end his life. And so he went to the courts and said it was against his human rights that he wasn't able to kill himself, and that he asked that a doctor should be able to kill him without the doctor risking prosecution. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and those of us who were in the field knew that if the Supreme Court passed this, that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, and that assisted suicide would become legalised here in the UK. But the Supreme Court eventually, it hung by a hair's breadth, and eventually they said, no, this is so important it should be left to the Parliament to decide. And when a vote came in Parliament in 2015, much to our surprise, of many of us who were in this field, in fact, there was a very strong vote of members of Parliament, House of Commons, against changing the law to legalise assisted suicide in the UK. And I must say, I was extremely relieved, because many countries around the world look to the UK as the gold standard in medical ethics and regulation. And there was no doubt that if we had voted in favour of assisted suicide, it would have gone across the world. As it is already spreading. There are many states now in the USA where assisted suicide is now legalised. California was one of the latest to go. The Supreme Court in Canada has said that assisted suicide should be legalised, and is effectively legal in Canada. And several places in mainland Europe are considering or about to change the law. So this again is the sort of the idealization of autonomy, my right to choose. And not surprisingly, it's spreading out of the place where it starts, with adults with cancer. It's spreading to children, it's spreading to people with psychiatric disorders, including things like anorexia nervosa, intractable depression, dementia. And so the use of technology and to allow people to end their lives is increasing. Dementia has replaced cancer as the death that most people fear most. And it is increasing numbers because it's an age-related illness, and because the number of elderly people in our society is increasing. The incidence of dementia is rapidly increasing, and there are voices saying, how on earth are we going to cope? And perhaps some kind of medical killing will be a solution. So these are thoughts which are largely unexpressed, but a few people have been courageous enough to come out and say it. This is Baroness Warnock, Mary Warnock, very well-known philosopher. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, you're wasting the resources of the NHS. I'm absolutely fully in agreement with the argument that if pain is insufferable, then someone should be given help to die. But I feel there's a wider argument that if somebody absolutely desperately wants to die because they're a burden to their family or the state, then I think they too should be allowed to die, by which she means they should be killed. Now, there was a storm of protest when she said that, and the Alzheimer's Society and various other people said this was outrageous, but she was actually verbalizing the comments which I've heard many times in private amongst the medical profession and others about how we as a society are going to survive in the future. So, how do we think about some of these complex and difficult things within from a Christian perspective, and particularly about the suffering and disease, and how do we relate a scientific perspective to a Christian perspective? And I have to say, as somebody who's spent many years in my career with people who are suffering and trying to weep with those who weep, I feel very concerned about the dangers of theodicy as a theological explanations for evil. And I think particularly there are these three dangers. First of all, that we minimize or trivialize the awfulness and the depth of human suffering caused by disease. So as somebody who's cared for children suffering with terrible genetic conditions and seen the awful reality of those kind of conditions, when I hear people say, well, of course, genetic abnormalities are just part of the mechanism by which evolution works, and therefore it's simply part of God's creative activities that genetic abnormalities have to happen. You know, I cannot square that with the realities of genetic suffering that I've seen. Secondly, we can imply that God is less than fully good, that his goodness is partial or variable or in some way suspect. Of course, this was C.S. Lewis. Those of you who've read A Grief Observed, his great fear was that God, who had allowed his wife to suffer in that way, was in some way a vivisector, somebody who was playing with humanity. Or third, we reduce God to a powerless observer of harmful and destructive processes within his creation. And I think all three are dangerous tendencies. And I want to reject all three because I don't think any of them are consistent with the character of God revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. And I found this concept, therefore, that suffering is not primarily a question which demands an answer, and it's not primarily a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence, and that we are not here to explain suffering, nor to trivialize it, or to explain it away, and our primary responsibility is to be there, to be the presence in the suffering, because that's himself what God in the person of Jesus is and does. I think just related to that is this question of what does it mean to die well? It's interesting that if you ask people, including Christian people in our society, how they would like to die, I think you can predict the commonest answer you will get. And that is, I want to die in my sleep. I want to die with absolutely no awareness. I want to have no warning. I want to go out like a light, just go to bed, bang, I've gone to heaven. Isn't that wonderful? What a wonderful way to die. Actually, no. You know, it's interesting, if you were to go back 300 years, sudden unexpected death was regarded as the worst possible way to die. To be catapulted into eternity with no possibility of preparing yourself, no possibility of saying goodbye to your loved ones, no possibility of asking forgiveness for past sins, no possibility of making preparation for your relatives, no possibility of saying the last words, just to go out like a light. What a terrible way to die. So isn't it interesting that what was seen as the worst possible way to die, isn't there a collect against sudden death? I think still in the Church of England, what was seen as the most terrible way to die has now become the ideal way to die. And it's interesting to reflect why. Actually, most people don't die like that. Most people die like this. Many, many people die like this. Either on the left here with failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a terrible way to die, with people jumping up and down in your chest, or else here on an intensive care unit with tubes coming out of every orifice. And there have been some interesting and challenging studies, particularly in the States, where they've looked at people with terminal illness, and they've particularly asked those who use, quotes, religious coping as a way of coping with their terminal illness, and then they've followed them through to see how they actually die. And you know what their conclusion is? And now there are several studies that have shown the same thing. People who use religious coping, at least in the States, are more likely to die in an intensive care unit. They're more likely to insist on futile and unnecessary medical treatment. They're less likely to have a do not resuscitate order, and they are less likely to have nominated someone else to make decisions on their behalf. And when the researchers said this is a bit strange and actually asked them why, there were two main reasons. And the first is, well, of course you've got to have every possible treatment, because if you don't, that's like euthanasia, isn't it? And that's wrong. So of course you have to have every possible treatment. And the second is, well, actually I'm trusting and praying that God's going to do a miracle and he's going to heal me, but of course I've got to give him the best possible chance. So if I don't go to the intensive care unit, then how is God going to heal me? Now you may think that both of these responses are not terribly theologically well informed, but nonetheless that is the reality. And so I think we've got a huge amount of work to do pastorally in helping Christian people to understand what it means to die well. This is partly self-interested. I'm writing a book, I'm wrestling with this book at the moment called Dying Well, which is intended for Christian believers to try to talk about these things and talk about what it means to die well and to die faithfully. So I had the great privilege as a medical student of going to All Souls Church in central London, and I came under the influence of John Stott, and to my great joy, he became like a spiritual father to me, and I was one of his informal physicians, and we walked the walk together for 40 years, all the way through to his eventual death. But he had a huge impact on me, and in particular, his vision of engaging in the modern world, of trying to address of building a bridge. One of the phrases he used was double listening. We had to listen to the world of the Spirit and the speaking in the Bible, but we also had to listen to the modern world and engage in it. And so, because of his influence, when I found myself in neonatology, I knew I had to try to think these things through and engage from a Christian perspective. And that drove me towards creation theology, because I think one of the fundamental principles is that Christian ethics, the way we call to treat one another, comes from Christian anthropology, the way we're made. And so this whole question of what does it mean to be human, what is distinctively human, comes from a Christian perspective from creation theology. And actually I think it's something which is still remarkably weak, that are in many areas of the Christian community anyway, that the sort of deep theological understanding of creation is weak. And I know this is one of the themes of this week, and I'm delighted that it is, because getting a rich and nuanced theology of creation is so important. And so, thinking about what it means to be human, and of course this is one of the foundational texts, that human beings are made in God's image, and theologians have laboured long and hard ever since the church fathers into precisely what this means and all the different ramifications of this phrase. And I'm not going to go in detail into them at all. But I think there is one aspect of this concept which is often lost, and that is that human beings are derivative. We are not self-explanatory. Our meaning, our significance is derived from outside ourselves because we're images. We are reflections. We are models of some other reality, of the being and character of God himself. And therefore, what it means to be human is not obvious from our structure. It's not obvious from our nature. We are not self-explanatory. And here's some kind of analogy. Suppose on the Andromeda galaxy, some super intelligent alien beings are receiving through their antenna a strange distorted image. And you can imagine these super intelligent beings analyzing this image with amazing precision, the precise frequency absorption of each pixel of the image, the precise spatial arrangements and topology, the geometrical patterns, and so on. They will never understand what they're looking at unless they understand that it's a map. It's the London Underground map. And so this strange abstract drawing of lines and colours represents another reality completely, which are these metallic objects which go trundling through a particular part of the planet. So these two things which appear to be so utterly different, an abstract drawing of lines and these metallic objects, are actually somehow interrelated. One is a map, an image of the other. Now that's just an analogy, but it seems to me that the God of the cosmos, the God of ultimate power and glory, chose to take a humble, pathetic, carbon-based life form and use that life form as a map, as a reflection. And therefore you will never understand what that carbon-based life form means unless you understand that we are reflections, we are derivative. So we're not self-explanatory. The structure of our humanity, the values and purposes of human lives only make sense in the light of our creation as reflections of another reality. But also we are created out of dust. And so, as you just heard in the previous talk, this Hebraic relationship between Adam and Adamah, the ground, is actually there in our name. As it is in human, did you know that is English? Did you know that the word human is derived from humus? Not the nice stuff you put on pita bread, but the compost heap. We are derived, we are groundlings. It's actually in our very name. And therefore, I think this is profoundly significant, and its significance is very often not emphasized. I think what this means is that we are designed and created to be fragile and frail and vulnerable, and to use a philosophical term, contingent, in other words, vulnerable to chance events. As I stand here talking to you, my life hangs by a thread. It would only take a tiny little microscopic clot in my coronary artery and I would have a cardiac arrest and collapse in front of you. It would only take a tiny little interference in the blood supply to my brain and I would lose the power of speech. It would only take tiny microscopic changes in my neurotransmitters and I would become psychotic and start hallucinating. And it's all part of our creation. We are designed to be dependent. We come into this world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And the very fact that you're sitting there means that when you were born, somebody loved you. Somebody washed you, somebody kept you warm, somebody fed you because you could do nothing for yourself. And then we go through this phase of our life where we look after other people and people become dependent on us. And then lo and behold, most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And this isn't some terrible, evil, horrible thing. No, this is creation. This is part of the way that God has made us. And this was brought home to me very powerfully when my dear mother, who was a very bright, intelligent, vivacious lady, was struck down with a horrible form of dementia. And she became utterly and totally dependent. She could do nothing for herself. She was doubly incontinent. She was confused. She was hallucinating. And I was visiting her and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon in my hand and I was trying to feed her, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth. And then I suddenly had this flashback. This is precisely what she used to do for me. And I remember thinking at the time, this is the way it was meant to be. I was learning more about what it meant to be a son, and she was learning more about what it meant to be a mother. Because dependence is part of the story. It's part of the narrative. It's part of what the human nature that God has given us. It's not a subhuman, undignified condition. It's part of the human narrative. And of course, in the biblical narrative, human frailty and vulnerability is then exacerbated and pervaded by the fall, by evil. So that dust now becomes a symbol of futility. Dust you are, and to dust you'll return. And what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. So the whole futility has now entered into our humanity. And yet, even within the creation, God has put remarkable therapeutic possibilities. So here is on the left the molecular structure of endorphin, which are natural, extremely powerful painkillers. And here on the right is the molecule produced by the poppy. And the circled bit is identical, and that's why the molecule produced by the poppy has the most incredible pain-relieving properties. And that's an entire, quote, coincidence. And yet, I as a doctor have just seen this extraordinary power of this molecule, which is there in creation. And when you see this person racked and terrified by the most excruciating pain, crying out in agony, and 4 hours later they are, with this seraphic smile, at peace and relaxed. And it's all because God put into the creation this molecule which just happens to work on the brain receptors. So and of course there are many other examples where you could show how even within the very creation God has made provision for our weakness. I'm running out of time. I'm just again going to very quickly just go through some of the principles and then I'm going to stop. When we can talk a bit more if you'd like about this question, when does human life begin? Of course the question is not when does life begin in the womb, the question is when is there a person? When is there a person who deserves protection? And I think as we think about human development, we have to hold together, to use theological terminology, the already and the not yet, that this being is in the process of becoming what it already is. And we have to hold together the physical and the immaterial. So this being in the womb is 1 cell click, 2 cells click, 4 cells click, 8 cells. And yet at the same time, God is calling into existence a unique individual whom he's known from before the foundation of the world and who is destined for eternity. I mean, how can that be? And the answer is, I haven't a clue. But they're both true, and we have to hold them together, as so often you do in Christian theology, holding the material and the immaterial. And as you go back in your own trajectory, in your own narrative, this is what you look like at all these different stages. That's exactly what you look like. Is there any point at which you can say, no, that's not me? I don't think there is. I think however far you go back into your own personal trajectory, you are there. But that we can't expect science or an electron microscope to tell us where there is a person. That's what the philosophers would call a category mistake. How do you find people? Answer, you find them by love. You find them by reaching out with love and commitment. And I found an example of this on the internet, where this is a transvaginal ultrasound. So this little blob is 5 millimeters, if you think what 5 millimeters is like. And yet love doesn't see a 5 millimeter blob. Love sees a baby. So as love reaches out, it sees a person. And I think that actually is very profound theologically. The Nicene Creed makes the distinction between begotten and made. And I think that's a very profound distinction, which I haven't time to bring out in greater concern. But that which we beget, that which we create, comes from our will and is ours to manipulate and mold. That which we beget or give birth to comes from our being and is equal to us in dignity. And so I think the danger of reproductive technology is that we start to see our children as a product of our will and not a gift from our being who are equal to us in dignity. And then perhaps just to close with this, the amazing power of Christian theology is that God doesn't just create this strange, pathetic, humble, carbon-based life form that's designed to be dependent and say, well, good luck with that, all the best with that, it's going to be difficult, but all the best. No, the God of the cosmos chooses to turn himself into a humble, pathetic, carbon-based life form, and he becomes utterly and totally dependent, and he can do nothing for himself, and he requires to be fed and to be washed, and yet what Christian theology teaches us is that even in that act, in that moment of utter and total dependence, his unique dignity and his status is in no way touched. He is still the second person of the Trinity, upholding the universe by the word of his power. So dependence does not diminish our dignity. And so please remember this. If at some time, as is likely in the future, you find yourself in a hospital bed and you need to be washed and you need to have your bottom wiped and you need to be fed and you are utterly dependent, your unique dignity and status and value as a human being is in no way touched by dependence. And that actually it is by bearing one another's burdens, by mutual interdependence, that we best reveal the character and the reality of God himself. I've run out of time, so I'll stop there, but we'll be happy to take it further.
Any questions for John or any very brief reflections? Yes, there's someone at the back. Thank you, Lizzie. If you can wait for the microphone to come to you. There it is.
I was very moved by your presentation of our dependence and the beauty of that. But I wondered if I kind of wanted to present our condition as not a limitation, but as a condition of our existence. I've been thinking on a sabbatical over the summer about we're physical and spiritual beings, and there are limitations to being spiritual. I don't know whether angels can feel what it's like to swim in water, feel the flow of it, to have the wind blowing on them, or appreciate the grain of wood and make something of it. But God must have thought it was a really good idea to make human beings in a material world. So to have a very high view of that, it's just a thought. Yeah.
Yes, no, thanks. I totally agree with you. In fact, Lewis has a fascinating essay along those lines, or maybe it comes in one of his letters, where he says that, the angels, precisely that, the angels can never really understand what it means to look at a sunset, what it means to experience good food, what it means. They know in theory. And then he says, perhaps even God himself had to become incarnate, flesh, before he could utterly experience the reality of his own creation. So that the incarnation is part of this extraordinary idea that God himself is developing and growing and exploring.
That's quite a thought.
It is, isn't it?
Wow.
Maybe heresy, but anyway.
No one's
Who am I? I'm a
shouted
baby
you
doctor.
down yet. So, but anyone else? Any more questions for? Yes, one here, and then we'll go to Ronnie.
I think there's a very great difficulty in reconciling how, in Christian teaching, we learn a life of service, and then the fact that there comes a point when we can offer no service.
Yes, thank you. And I think this is part of I think there is a problem. Of course, it is right that we are called to serve, but we mustn't fetishize our ability to care for others. I hear so many elderly people, including Christian people, say, I just don't want to be a burden to anyone. I'm very happy to help. I'm very happy to do anything I can. But if ever I need to be helped, if ever I need to be cared for, then I'm going to say to God, thank you very much. I've had my life. it's time to go to heaven now, goodbye. And frankly, I think my response was to say something like, you are wrong, you are designed to be a burden to me, and I'm designed to be a burden to you. And the life that God has given us is one of mutual burdensomeness. And actually the gift of receiving, see, that's partly what I see in the incarnation, that the God of the universe allowed himself to be fed. He allows himself to have his bottom wiped. So he is not just a servant, he is also a receiver. He is a served. And that is part of this mystery, isn't it, of the life that God has given us. And that just 3 days ago, a very close friend of mine, elderly Christian, who had spent his own whole life in serving and who was very, very resistant to the idea of being served. And I was at his deathbed, literally, and it was really only in the last 2 days of his life that he learnt to let go, and that he learnt that he could do nothing for himself. And actually I saw that as growth, that in his own journey he was learning and growing. And one of the sad things to me is that so many Christian people never learn that. They go all the way to their deathbed and they never learn that. So God has more to teach us. And of course, I didn't have time to talk about palliative care, but the wonderful insight of palliative care is that the dying process can also be part of life. And Cicely Saunders said, not only will we help you to die well, we will help you to live before you die. And so that phrase, to live before you die, is a very central Christian idea, that even in that dying process, there is more to learn, there is more to grow, there is more to receive.
Yes, and I think Rodney had a question at the back.
There was a very interesting case a month or two back of the girl who wanted to be frozen when she died. And when it's at one level you can think this is laughable, but on the other hand it's desperately tragic, isn't it? Yeah. That she would want it and it would be agreed by the courts, and then and this basically seems to be a whole fraudulent idea. So, but do you have any comments about that?
No, I think you're right, Rodney. I think it does express this desperate longing for something beyond, which is, of course, rooted in our humanity, that we are designed and created to long for something beyond the grave. In Ecclesiastes, God has put eternity in our heart. A beautiful phrase I've just come across from Tom Wright that says, love is not just our duty. In fact, it isn't our duty. It's our destiny. In other words, we are written into our very being is the fact that we're destined to experience love in its fullness. So this questing that materialistic people have leads off in all sorts of different ways. I know that, there's a very tragic comic version of this at my own University College London, because Jeremy Bentham, naturalistic philosopher, decided to have his body embalmed and insisted that his body was brought out to attend every college meeting, and it still is. Except that 19th century methods of embalming were so ineffective that eventually his body became so disgusting. They now bring out a sort of plastic effigy. But, you think it's a sort of, you couldn't make it up, but it's that kind of tragic materialistic design. I'm afraid the cryonic stuff is fraudulent and it is tapping into this desperate longing that people have. But of course, what the Christian gospel says is that the route to the next phase of life is not through life extension. It is actually through death and resurrection, which is, of course, which Christ himself has gone before as the first fruits.
Now, the last question, just over here.
So it's just to follow up on that case of the 14-year-old girl. I read the judge's judgment on that case, and it was very interesting. There were two things he says at the end. One of which is that after he had allowed that to happen, at the request of the girl herself, he went to visit her, so that she, in her own words, could thank him for allowing this to happen. But he also said because he was there, the day when she died, her mother was so obsessed with carrying out this wish and all the business and paraphernalia and medical stuff that has to go on so that organs can be preserved and all that, that she wasn't there to basically attend to her daughter's death. And that her daughter died alone.
Yeah.
With no one to hold her hand.
Yes, thanks. Oh, well, I'm afraid that is the reality so often, that in this desperate desire to quest after a materialistic future, actually you damage the most important thing, the human reality of the dying process.
And we do. That was a quick one, so we do have time for one more if there are any more questions. Yes, just here.
It's just a reflection. I've spent my life encouraging people in ministry with children generally. And that's quite hard because on the whole the church values grown-ups. So they kind of tolerate children and they minister to them, but preferably in a different place. So the whole dependency thing is quite hard for the church. And I just wonder if that has a bearing on your understanding or your observation about Christians at the end of their life finding it difficult to be dependent.
Yes, thanks. I think there's something in that. I think actually we've been much more infected as a Christian community by the philosophy of the Enlightenment than we realise. And it sounds rather virtuous to say, well, I don't want to be a burden and I just want to serve. But actually, it's just theologically wrong. It's not part of the Christian gospel. I do think there is a desperate challenge for the church about question, what are old people for? Because there are huge numbers of old people and they are increasing. And I only have to look around the room, and I include myself, to see how many old people there are. And yet, I would say our church has become very youth orientated. It is all about the family service. It is all about the youth worker. It is all about young families. And elderly people, you tolerate them, but they don't really have a role. So I think developing a theology of old age is incredibly important, because there is this whole culture of youth with which we're infected. It's all about, trying to appear 20 years younger than you really are. And is that Christian? So I'm thinking of starting a new movement, and it's going to be called Wear Your Wrinkles with Pride. And, as in traditional Christian understanding, the grey hair, the wrinkles, the flabby skin, all the evidence of aging is actually evidence of God's faithfulness. It's evidence of God's continuing goodness to me over many years. And I don't want to be 25 again, frankly. I don't want to just go back. I'm grateful for God's faithfulness to me over the 64 years I've achieved so far, and I want to celebrate that. I don't want to be ashamed of it, and I want to help my other elderly people to celebrate it with me. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but wouldn't that be gloriously countercultural in an age which is obsessed by youth and beauty and the celeb culture, that if we could really wear our wrinkles with pride, wouldn't that be a wonderful evidence of the gospel?
Well, that's a great note to finish on. I'm sure I can muster up some wrinkles to be proud of. Thank you very much, John, for everything you've served us with.